2 in the morning is the kind of hour when the mountains go completely silent. No traffic, no voices, just wind moving through the pine trees. That silence is exactly why the alert on my phone made my stomach drop. Motion detected. My security cameras rarely picked up anything besides deer wandering past the driveway. But when I opened the live feed, my entire world stopped. My cabin was already burning. Bright orange flames were crawling up the cedar porch beams I had carved myself 3 years earlier. The fire moved fast, hungry, like it had been waiting for this moment. Sparks were floating into the dark sky above the trees. And standing right there in the middle of my driveway was Karen Holloway. She held an empty red gas can in one hand and a lighter in the other. The self-appointed president of a fake HOA that didn't even legally exist. She wasn't panicking. She wasn't trying to hide. She was smiling. Not the nervous kind of smile people give when they know they've done something wrong. No, Karen looked like she was admiring a fireworks show. Like watching my home burn was entertainment. I threw the truck into gear and tore down the mountain road, tires sliding through gravel as emergency alerts began flooding my phone. Smoke alarms, camera notifications, heat sensors, every warning system I had installed screaming at once. By the time I reached the property, the fire department had already arrived. Flames were ripping through the roof. My workshop, the place where I spent years rebuilding my life after losing my wife, was already collapsing inward. Tools, furniture, memories, everything turning into smoke and embers. Firefighters were doing everything they could, but I knew the truth the moment I stepped out of the truck. The cabin was gone. And Karen Holloway? She had vanished into the dark long before the first siren reached the valley. Most people watching their home burn would feel helpless, broken, finished. But standing there in the glow of those flames, I realized something Karen didn't know. She thought she had just erased the only witness. What she didn't realize was that the quiet man she had spent months trying to bully out of this mountain used to spend 20 years sitting behind a courtroom bench. And people who commit crimes right in front of a judge rarely understand the mistake they just made. Karen Holloway thought she had just won. In reality, she had just declared war on the wrong man. If you want to hear more true stories like this, make sure you hit that subscribe button to HOA Update. And tell me in the comments, where are you watching from? A few hours before my cabin burned, my life had been quiet. Not perfect, not carefree, but quiet in a way that only a mountain valley can be. I moved to Stonebridge Ridge 3 years earlier after losing my wife Lillian. Cancer doesn't just take a person, it strips the life around them piece by piece. By the time the hospital machines finally went silent, the house we had lived in for 20 years felt hollow. Every room echoed with memories I couldn't escape. So I left. I sold the suburban house, packed what little mattered, and drove west until the highways turned into dirt roads and the noise of the world finally faded behind me. That's how I found Stonebridge Ridge, a narrow valley tucked between pine-covered slopes where the air smelled like wood and cold water. Most importantly, the land came with one promise. No HOA. That detail mattered more than people might think. The folks living out there valued independence. Most of them had moved to the mountains for the same reason I had, to be left alone. My nearest neighbor was nearly half a mile away. Victor Hale, a retired Marine who had lost part of his leg overseas, lived in a small ranch house across the ridge. Elena Torres lived further down the valley, raising 2 kids after her husband was killed in Iraq. A few older couples had cabins scattered through the trees, people who had spent their lives working and now just wanted peace. Nobody told anyone how to paint their house. Nobody complained about fence heights or garden layouts. If someone needed help fixing a roof, neighbors showed up. That was the entire system. For the first 2 years, life was simple. I spent most of my time building the cabin myself. I cut the beams from local pine, shaped the wood in my workshop, and slowly turned an empty patch of land into something solid again. Work like that gives your mind somewhere to go when grief starts creeping back in. By the time the place was finished, it finally felt like home. Then Karen Holloway arrived. At first, nobody paid much attention. She bought 3 properties on the southern edge of the valley and showed up driving a spotless black SUV that looked completely ridiculous on our gravel roads. Karen was the kind of person who dressed like she expected cameras to be following her. Expensive sunglasses, designer jackets, shoes that had clearly never touched mud before. Within a month, she started organizing community meetings. At the first one, she talked about protecting property values and creating a better future for Stonebridge Ridge. Some people listened politely, Others just shrugged and went back to their lives. That should have been the end of it. But a few weeks later, letters started showing up in mailboxes. Official-looking envelopes with bold titles printed across the top. Stonebridge Ridge Homeowners Association. The first notices demanded HOA dues. Then came compliance warnings. After that, architectural review requirements. Most people assumed it was some kind of mistake. Stonebridge Ridge had never had an HOA. I ignored the first letter completely. It didn't have any legal authority behind it, and whoever sent it clearly didn't understand how property law works. Then Karen showed up in my driveway. I was in the middle of cutting lumber when I heard tires crunching on gravel. She stepped out of that SUV wearing a white coat that probably cost more than the truck I was driving. She walked up holding a clipboard like she was delivering a package. "Caleb Mercer?" she asked. I nodded. Karen smiled the kind of smile that doesn't reach someone's eyes. "I'm Karen Holloway, president of the Stonebridge Ridge Homeowners Association." She handed me a document. At the bottom was a total amount due, $12,000. HOA dues, compliance fees, late penalties. I stared at the paper for a moment before handing it back. "There is no HOA here," I told her. Karen didn't argue. She didn't get angry either. She just gave a small, patient smile, the kind people use when they think they're explaining something obvious to a child. "Oh," she said calmly, "there is now." At first, I assumed she was bluffing. But over the next few weeks, the whispers around the valley started getting louder. Victor Hale received a notice demanding he remove the wheelchair ramp attached to his porch because it violated architectural harmony guidelines. Elena Torres was fined for having a children's swing set in her backyard. Two elderly couples were threatened with property liens over landscaping violations. One neighbor showed me a letter claiming his house could be seized if he didn't comply with new HOA regulations. That was the moment everything stopped feeling like a misunderstanding. Karen Holloway wasn't trying to improve the neighborhood. She was building control, and then the certified letter arrived. Official envelope, legal formatting, threatening language. It claimed the Stonebridge Ridge HOA now had the authority to enforce fines, seize property, and remove residents who refused to comply. Reading it, I realized something far more dangerous than petty HOA harassment was taking shape in our valley. Karen Holloway wasn't just annoying. She was constructing power piece by piece, and every target she picked had something in common. They were people she believed couldn't fight back. Karen didn't waste time after that first conversation in my driveway. Within a week, the letters started arriving again, this time thicker, more official-looking, and far more aggressive. One envelope showed up on Monday, another on Tuesday. By Friday afternoon, I had 6 violation notices sitting on my kitchen table. 6, all dated within the same week. According to the so-called Stonebridge Ridge Homeowners Association, my property was apparently a disaster. The driveway gravel I used violated approved surface materials. The stain on my cabin exterior was listed as an unapproved wood treatment. My workshop, the same building I had constructed 2 years earlier without a single complaint, was now labeled an unauthorized secondary structure. Then there were violations for fencing, parking areas, and landscaping irregularities that existed only in someone's imagination. Each notice included a fine, and at the bottom of the stack sat a demand for payment totaling over $15,000. I looked through the paperwork carefully. Every page tried to look official. There were legal phrases, bold headers, and seals printed in dark blue ink, but something about them felt off. I couldn't put my finger on it at first. The language was too dramatic. The formatting was slightly wrong. Certain legal references didn't quite line up with the statutes they claimed to cite. Still, before I could dig deeper, Karen decided paperwork wasn't moving fast enough. 3 days later, she came back. This time she didn't come alone. I heard the vehicle before I saw it, the same black SUV pulling up the dirt road, followed by a white pickup truck. Karen stepped out first, clipboard in hand, while 2 men climbed out of the truck behind her. They were dressed like contractors. Tool belts, boots, baseball caps pulled low over their eyes. Karen walked straight past my gate like she owned the place. "Inspection day," she called out cheerfully. I stepped out of the workshop and wiped sawdust off my hands. "What exactly are you doing on my property?" I asked. She didn't stop walking. "These gentlemen are HOA inspectors," she said casually, waving the clipboard in my direction. "We're conducting a compliance review." One of the men had already started pacing along the side of the cabin, taking photos with his phone. The other walked toward the shed behind my workshop. That's when I raised my voice. Stop. They froze. Karen turned slowly, the same smile returning to her face. You need to leave, I said. Karen tilted her head slightly. Oh, Caleb, she said in a patient tone. The HOA has full authority to conduct property inspections. I stepped closer to the gate. There is no HOA, I replied calmly. And even if there were, walking onto private land without permission is still trespassing. The two men looked uncertain. Karen didn't. She just crossed her arms and leaned lightly against the hood of her SUV. Well, she said, that cold smile widening just a little, then I guess you can take it to court. That moment was the first time I realized something important about Karen Holloway. She wasn't bluffing. She genuinely believed she could bully the entire valley into submission. And unfortunately, it started working. Over the next month, the pressure spread through Stonebridge Ridge like a slow infection. Victor Hale received a certified notice demanding he remove the wheelchair ramp from his front porch because it violated neighborhood aesthetics. Victor had lost half his leg in Afghanistan. Without that ramp, he couldn't even enter his own house. Elena Torres received a letter warning that her children's swing set posed a liability risk and would be removed if she didn't comply with HOA safety guidelines. Two elderly couples further down the ridge were threatened with property liens over unapproved landscaping. One family quietly packed up and moved away after Karen's lawyers began sending foreclosure warnings. Fear does strange things to people. Most of my neighbors just wanted peace. They weren't interested in legal battles or drawn-out conflicts. The more Karen pushed, the more people started wondering if maybe it was easier to comply. Karen understood that intimidation was her strategy. But the more paperwork she sent me, the more something about it bothered me. I started examining every page carefully. That's when the details began standing out. The formatting didn't match real legal filings. The official-looking seals were clearly copied from somewhere else. Even the statutes listed in the documents didn't exist in the legal codes they referenced. Karen's paperwork wasn't just aggressive. It was fake. And once I started digging deeper, the situation became even stranger. Because the name Karen Holloway didn't show up in any legitimate HOA filings, property boards, or real estate registries tied to our county. That alone was suspicious. But when I expanded the search beyond the county line, something far worse appeared. Multiple property disputes across different states, fraud complaints, insurance investigations, and several suspicious fires connected to neighborhoods where a woman with a very similar description had previously lived. The name attached to those cases wasn't Karen Holloway, it was Elizabeth Crawford. And suddenly, the woman trying to control our quiet mountain valley looked a lot less like an annoying HOA president and a lot more like a career criminal who had been running the same scheme in different towns for years. The moment I uncovered the name Elizabeth Crawford tied to Karen Holloway, something inside me shifted. Up until then, the situation had been ugly but manageable. Annoying letters. Empty threats. A woman trying to bully a rural neighborhood into believing she had authority she didn't. But once I realized she had been involved in similar schemes in other states, I understood something else. Karen wasn't improvising. She was following a pattern, and that's when the harassment stopped feeling random. It became personal. The first sign came 3 nights later. I walked down the driveway early one morning to check my mailbox, the way I always did with a cup of coffee in my hand. Except the mailbox wasn't there anymore. It had been ripped clean off the wooden post and thrown halfway down the slope beside the road. The metal door hung twisted and bent, like someone had taken a hammer to it for sport. Inside the box were the same familiar envelopes, more HOA violations, more fines, more threats. I set the broken mailbox back on the post as best I could and went back inside without saying a word. 2 days later, my internet went out. At first, I assumed it was the weather. Mountain storms knock out lines all the time. But when the technician arrived and followed the cable down the property line, he stopped about 20 yards from the road. The cable had been cut clean through. Not torn by wind, not chewed by animals. Cut, someone had used bolt cutters. The technician shook his head and said it looked intentional. I thanked him and watched his truck disappear down the ridge road. Then I walked back toward the workshop. That building had become the center of my life out there. It was where I spent the long evenings shaping wood, fixing tools, and giving my hands something to do when my mind wandered back to memories of Lillian. When I reached the door, something immediately felt wrong. The padlock was hanging open. The door itself was slightly crooked in the frame. Inside, the place looked like a tornado had passed through. Drawers were pulled out and dumped on the floor. Shelves had been knocked over. Tools I'd spent years collecting were scattered everywhere. Some were smashed, others were simply gone. A workbench I built with Lillian years before she died had been split down the middle with what looked like a sledgehammer. For a long time, I just stood there staring at the wreckage. The workshop wasn't just a building. It was a place where I had slowly rebuilt a life after losing everything. Now it looked like a war zone. I eventually forced myself to move and check the security system. The cameras had captured part of the break-in, a figure moving through the doorway late at night, face hidden beneath a hood. But whoever it was knew where the cameras were. They stayed mostly out of view. Still, the timing of the attack made one thing obvious. Karen's war had moved beyond letters and paperwork. I drove into town the next morning and spoke with Sheriff Cole Maddox. He was a practical man in his 50s who had been running the county department for a long time. After reviewing the footage and the damage report, he leaned back in his chair with a tired expression. "Problem is," he said, tapping the desk lightly, "this isn't enough to make an arrest." "Not even for vandalism?" I asked. "We'd need a clear identification," he replied. "Right now, it's just a masked person in a dark hoodie." He paused for a moment, then added something that stayed with me. "But if this keeps escalating, you need to be careful." Escalating. That was exactly what was happening. Over the next several weeks, Karen turned the pressure up across the entire valley. The letters got worse. They now included foreclosure warnings, property seizure notices, threats of forced compliance. She started holding community meetings at a rented hall near the highway, and those meetings quickly turned hostile. Karen would stand at the front of the room presenting charts, documents, and speeches about protecting the neighborhood. And every single time my name came up, according to Karen, I was the problem. She told people I was sabotaging the community, that I was secretly trying to destroy property values, that I had a criminal history and had moved to the mountains to hide from it. Most of it was ridiculous. But rumors don't have to make sense to spread. A few neighbors started avoiding eye contact when we crossed paths. Others simply looked tired, like they were caught in the middle of something they never wanted. One older couple quietly put their property up for sale. Another family left the valley completely. Fear was doing exactly what Karen wanted. It was breaking the community apart. But leaving had never crossed my mind. Instead, I started documenting everything. Every letter, every violation notice, every strange vehicle driving past the property, every interaction, because the longer Karen pushed, the more certain I became of one thing. Eventually, she would make a mistake, and when she did, I intended to be ready. What I didn't expect was just how far she was willing to go. 3 weeks later, just after midnight, sirens echoed across the valley. The glow appeared over the trees long before anyone reached the road, orange flames rising into the night sky. The fire was coming from the southern end of Stonebridge Ridge, from Elena Torres's house. By the time firefighters arrived, the entire structure was already engulfed. Elena and her children made it out alive, but the house was gone within minutes. Investigators arrived the next morning, and after only a few hours of examining the scene, they confirmed what many of us had already suspected. The fire hadn't been an accident. It was arson. Standing there watching the blackened remains of Elena's home, something cold settled in my chest, because suddenly the pattern made sense. The intimidation, the vandalism, the threats. Karen Holloway wasn't just trying to control our valley. She was willing to burn it down to do it. The morning after Elena Torres's house burned down, the entire valley felt different. You could see it in people's faces. Conversations were quieter. Doors stayed closed longer than usual. Smoke still hung faintly in the air from the charred remains of her home at the bottom of the ridge. Fire investigators worked the scene most of the morning, moving slowly through the debris with careful precision. They collected fragments, examined burn patterns, and took photographs of every corner of what used to be Elena's living room. By early afternoon, the lead investigator walked over to Sheriff Cole Maddox and spoke quietly with him for a few minutes. I didn't need to hear the conversation. The sheriff's expression told me everything. It wasn't an accident. Later that evening, Sheriff Maddox confirmed it. The fire had started in multiple locations at once, a classic indicator of deliberate ignition. Whoever did it knew exactly what they were doing. Accelerant traces were found along the outer walls and under the back porch. It was arson. Elena and her kids were lucky to be alive. Standing there watching the blackened remains of that house, one thought kept circling in my mind. This wasn't escalation anymore. This was a pattern. And if there was a pattern, there had to be a history behind it. So that night I started digging deeper into Karen Holloway. The first thing I confirmed was what I had already suspected. Karen Holloway didn't exist. The woman who had been terrorizing Stonebridge Ridge had been using an alias. Her real name was Elizabeth Crawford. Once I had the real name, everything else started falling into place. Property disputes in Arizona, insurance investigations in Nevada, fraud complaints in Oregon. Each case followed a disturbingly similar pattern. Elizabeth Crawford would appear in a quiet community and begin inserting herself into local property disputes. Sometimes she claimed to represent an HOA. Sometimes she claimed to be part of a property management company. In every case, the pressure escalated the same way. Threats, legal intimidation, and eventually, fire. At least 3 homes across different states had burned under suspicious circumstances after disputes involving Elizabeth Crawford. Insurance claims followed shortly afterward, but every investigation had stalled before prosecutors could prove anything. Until now. I printed everything I could find and drove into town the next morning to see someone who understood property law far better than most people. Claire Whitaker. Claire and I had known each other for years. She ran a small law office near the courthouse and had built a reputation as one of the sharpest property lawyers in the county. When I walked into her office and dropped the stack of documents onto her desk, she raised an eyebrow. "This looks serious," she said. "Take a look," I replied. Claire spent nearly an hour reading through the HOA paperwork Karen had been sending around the valley. The more pages she turned, the more her expression changed. Finally, she leaned back in her chair and let out a short laugh. "Well," she said, tapping one of the documents with her finger, "this woman just made a very big mistake." "What kind of mistake?" I asked. Claire rotated the paper toward me. "See this?" she said, pointing to the signature at the bottom. The document carried the seal of a county judge authorizing enforcement authority for the so-called Stonebridge Ridge Homeowners Association. Only one problem. The signature didn't belong to any judge currently serving in the county. It didn't belong to any judge who had ever served here. It was a forgery. Claire flipped through the rest of the stack. "Same thing here," she continued. "Fake court references, fake authorization orders, fabricated enforcement language." She looked up at me. "This isn't just harassment, Caleb. These documents are forged judicial orders." "What does that mean legally?" I asked. Claire's expression turned serious. "It means your fake HOA president just crossed from civil harassment into federal crime territory. Forgery of judicial authority wasn't something small-town prosecutors handled lightly. It involved fraud, impersonation of government authority, and potential racketeering charges if it was tied to a larger scheme. In other words, Elizabeth Crawford wasn't just a nuisance. She was running a criminal operation." Claire gathered the documents into a neat stack and folded her hands together. "You know what the ironic part of this is?" she asked. "What?" "You spent 20 years presiding over arson and property crime cases." I nodded. Before retiring to the mountains, I had served 2 decades on the bench handling criminal cases across the region. A surprising number of those cases involved arson, property disputes that escalated into fire. Patterns like that are hard to forget once you've seen them enough times. Claire gave a small smile. She spent months trying to bully the one man in this valley who knows exactly how criminals like her operate. For the first time since this whole situation began, I felt something different, not anger. Clarity. Karen, or Elizabeth Crawford, believed she was controlling the narrative. She believed intimidation would keep everyone scattered and afraid, but now I knew exactly what she was doing. And more importantly, I knew how to stop it. Up until that moment, I had been reacting to everything she did. Trying to defend the valley, trying to keep people safe. That approach wasn't going to end this. People like Elizabeth Crawford only stop when they walk straight into consequences they can't escape. I stood up and gathered the papers from Claire's desk. "So what's the plan?" she asked. I looked at the forged documents one more time before sliding them into the folder. Then I gave her the only answer that made sense. "If Karen wants a courtroom," I closed the folder, "I'll give her one." Once Claire and I understood exactly who Karen Holloway really was, Elizabeth Crawford, the situation stopped being about neighborhood harassment. It became a criminal investigation. But proving that required more than suspicion. People like Crawford had survived for years by staying just one step ahead of the law. Every town she entered, every dispute she stirred up, every house that mysteriously burned, she had always managed to slip away before prosecutors could connect the dots. If we were going to stop her, we needed evidence that couldn't be ignored. So instead of confronting her, I did the opposite. I went quiet. Karen continued sending letters and threats, expecting the same resistance she'd been getting for months. But suddenly I stopped arguing. I stopped responding to notices. From the outside, it probably looked like I had finally given up. That was exactly what we wanted her to believe. Behind the scenes, things were moving fast. Victor Hale was the first person to step forward when I explained what Claire and I had uncovered. The retired Marine had spent years working with surveillance equipment during his service, and he understood immediately what needed to happen. Within days, small cameras began appearing around the valley. They were placed carefully, near road entrances, along tree lines, overlooking driveways and paths that connected the scattered properties. Nothing intrusive, nothing illegal. Just enough to monitor activity in places where no one had been watching before. Victor handled most of the installations himself, moving quietly from property to property with a small toolkit and a duffel bag of equipment. Meanwhile, Elena Torres gathered every document Karen had ever sent her: threatening emails, certified letters, notices demanding fines or threatening foreclosure. Some of them included language that made it painfully clear Karen had been targeting Elena long before the fire destroyed her home. Those records helped establish something important: motive. Claire Whitaker handled the next step. After reviewing the forged HOA documents again, she contacted federal investigators and presented the evidence. It didn't take long before the case drew attention from outside the county. 2 weeks later, I received a phone call from Agent Rebecca Sloan. She arrived the next morning in an unmarked SUV and spent nearly 3 hours sitting at my kitchen table reviewing everything we had gathered: the fake HOA filings, the financial demands, the vandalism reports, the surveillance footage. When she finally leaned back in her chair, she looked thoughtful. "Your instincts are probably right," she said. "About what?" I asked. "That Elizabeth Crawford isn't done yet." Agent Sloan explained something that made the situation even more unsettling. Arsonists who use intimidation rarely stop after a single fire. If Crawford's past cases were any indication, the first fire was usually meant as a warning. The next one tended to be much worse, which meant there was a good chance she was already planning something else. That possibility changed the strategy. Instead of waiting for Crawford to make a move somewhere else in the valley, we decided to give her a target she couldn't resist: my cabin. The rebuilding process had already begun after the fire Karen started months earlier, and construction equipment still surrounded parts of the property. From the outside, it looked like the perfect opportunity for someone who wanted to finish the job. Hidden cameras were installed across the entire area. Motion sensors were repositioned. Victor helped place several discrete audio recorders near the driveway and workshop. From that point forward, every inch of the property was being monitored. All we had to do was wait. And Karen didn't disappoint. 3 days later, a new announcement appeared in everyone's mailbox: Stonebridge Ridge Homeowners Association emergency hearing. The meeting was scheduled for the following Saturday night at the small school gym just outside the valley. According to the letter, the purpose of the meeting was to vote on final enforcement action against properties refusing HOA authority, specifically mine. Karen claimed the meeting would determine whether my land should be seized for repeated violations and unpaid fines. To most of the valley, it looked like the final step in forcing me out. But by the time those letters went out, Agent Sloan and her team were already preparing something very different. Because the meeting Karen believed would cement her power over Stonebridge Ridge was about to become something else entirely. A stage, a room full of witnesses, and the perfect place for a criminal to walk directly into the consequences she had spent years avoiding. Karen Holloway believed that meeting would finally end my place in the valley. What she didn't realize was that it was about to end something far more permanent: her freedom. By the time Saturday night arrived, the entire valley seemed to know about the meeting. Cars began pulling into the gravel lot outside the old school gym nearly an hour before it started. Headlights cut through the cold mountain air as neighbors stepped out quietly, some talking in low voices, others simply watching the building like they weren't sure what they were about to walk into. The atmosphere felt heavier than any normal community gathering. Everyone knew why they were there. Karen Holloway had promised a final decision. Inside the gym, folding chairs were arranged in rows facing a long table set up near the stage. Fluorescent lights hummed overhead, casting a dull glow across the polished wood floor. The place smelled faintly of dust and old varnish. One by one, residents took their seats. Some looked angry, some looked nervous. A few simply looked exhausted from months of conflict. Victor Hale arrived early and took a seat toward the back wall. He leaned his crutch against the chair beside him and folded his hands calmly in his lap. Anyone glancing his way might have assumed he was just another neighbor waiting for the meeting to begin. But Victor's eyes moved slowly around the room, watching, counting. Near the middle rows, a couple sat quietly whispering to each other. Across the aisle, a tall man in a brown jacket leaned against the wall with his arms crossed. A woman near the entrance pretended to scroll through her phone. To most of the people there, they were strangers, but I knew exactly who they were. Agent Rebecca Sloan had placed several FBI agents throughout the room before the meeting even started. They blended in easily among the residents. Karen never noticed. The doors opened again a few minutes later, and the sound of high heels echoed across the gym floor. Karen Holloway walked in like she owned the building. She wore a dark blazer and carried a thick folder under one arm. Behind her trailed two of the same men who had shown up months earlier claiming to be HOA inspectors. They looked confident too, scanning the room with the smug expressions of people who believed they had already won. Karen stepped up to the long table at the front of the gym and set her folder down carefully. The room slowly quieted. "Thank you all for coming tonight," she began, her voice smooth and controlled. "This meeting will finally resolve the ongoing issues that have been damaging the Stonebridge Ridge community." Her eyes moved across the room until they landed on me. I was sitting near the front row. Karen smiled. "For months now," she continued, "one individual has refused to comply with the rules established to protect our neighborhood." A few murmurs spread through the crowd. Karen lifted a stack of papers from the folder and held them up. "These documents clearly show repeated violations, unpaid fines, and deliberate attempts to undermine the authority of the Stonebridge Ridge Homeowners Association." She placed the papers on the table and looked around the room like a prosecutor addressing a jury. "Mr. Strad, Caleb Mercer has refused every opportunity to resolve this matter peacefully." Her tone shifted slightly, becoming sharper. "He has spread false accusations, intimidated neighbors, and attempted to sabotage the future of this community." Several people shifted in their seats. Victor remained completely still near the back wall. Karen pointed toward me. "For the sake of every homeowner here, we must take action tonight." She began outlining the proposal. According to her documents, the HOA had the authority to seize my property for repeated non-compliance. If the vote passed, the land would be placed under HOA management until the fines were paid, or until I left. Karen spoke with the confidence of someone who believed the outcome was already guaranteed. Each sentence made her voice a little stronger. Each accusation became a little harsher. And through all of it, I said nothing. I simply sat there, hands folded, listening. Karen noticed the silence. She mistook it for defeat. "You've had every chance to respond, Caleb," she said, her voice carrying across the gym. "If you have anything to say in your defense, now would be the time." The room turned toward me. Neighbors waited. Victor watched carefully from the back row. But I remained seated. Karen gave a small shrug and turned back to the crowd. "Well," she said, spreading her hands slightly, "I believe his silence speaks for itself." She lifted the final sheet from the stack of documents. "This motion calls for the immediate enforcement of HOA authority over the Mercer property." Karen looked around the room, completely certain of what was about to happen. "All those in favor," she raised her hand to begin the vote, and that was the moment I finally stood up. The moment I stood up, the room fell completely silent. Karen had already raised her hand to begin the vote, but when she saw me on my feet, her expression shifted slightly. Just a flicker, the first crack in the confidence she had been wearing all night. "Well," she said, lowering her arms slowly, "looks like Mr. Singh." Mercer finally decided to speak. Every pair of eyes in the gym turned toward me. For months, Karen had controlled every room she walked into. She dominated conversations, twisted facts, and used stacks of official-looking papers to convince people she held real authority. Tonight, she expected the same thing. I stepped forward calmly. "You're right about one thing," I said, my voice steady. "This meeting will resolve everything." Karen folded her arms, smiling again. "Wonderful," she replied. "Then by all means, explain why you've refused every lawful order issued by this HOA." I didn't answer her question. Instead, I reached into my jacket and placed a small remote on the table in front of her. The projector mounted above the gym floor flickered to life. A moment later, the large screen behind Karen lit up. At first, the image looked like ordinary security footage. Grainy, black and white video from a camera mounted somewhere outside. Then the scene became clear. A house at the edge of Stonebridge Ridge. Elena Torres's house. The video showed a car pulling slowly into the driveway late at night. The driver stepped out carrying a red container, gasoline. Karen's smile faded. The footage zoomed in as the woman moved toward the porch. The face became visible. Karen Holloway. Or rather, Elizabeth Crawford. The room erupted into confused murmurs. "What is this?" Karen snapped, turning toward the screen. The footage continued playing. The woman on screen poured gasoline along the side of the house, across the wooden steps, beneath the porch railing. Then she struck a lighter. Flames exploded across the structure in seconds. Someone in the audience gasped. Another person shouted Karen's name. Karen's face had gone completely pale. "This is fabricated," she said quickly, turning toward the crowd. "This is an obvious attempt to—" "Actually," a calm voice interrupted from behind her, "it's not." Agent Rebecca Sloan stepped forward from the middle row. At the same time, two other agents near the walls moved toward the front of the room. Their badges flashed under the fluorescent lights. The crowd parted instinctively as they approached. Karen's eyes darted from one agent to another. "This meeting is over," she said sharply, grabbing her folder from the table. She turned toward the exit. But she didn't make it more than 3 steps. Victor Hale rose from his chair near the back wall and stepped directly into the aisle. The crutch he leaned on didn't slow him down at all. Karen stopped abruptly. For a moment, the two of them simply stared at each other. The woman who had spent months threatening to remove his wheelchair ramp, and the veteran she believed she could bully. Victor's voice was quiet but firm. "You're not going anywhere." Karen looked around desperately now, realizing the room had completely turned against her. Agent Sloan reached her in 3 quick strides. "Elizabeth Crawford," she said clearly, pulling a pair of handcuffs from her belt, "you are under arrest for multiple counts of arson, fraud, and attempted murder." Karen's composure shattered. "This is ridiculous," she shouted, trying to pull away. "You can't prove any of this." Agent Sloan calmly secured the cuffs around her wrists. "We already have," she replied. The entire gym had gone silent again. People stared as the woman who had spent months terrorizing the valley was now standing handcuffed in the middle of the room. Her 2 so-called inspectors had already slipped out the side door the moment the agents revealed themselves. Karen's fake authority evaporated in seconds. The documents she had waved around earlier now sat scattered across the table, meaningless pieces of paper. Agent Sloan guided her toward the exit. Karen twisted once more to look back at the crowd, at the neighbors she had tried to intimidate for months. But no one stepped forward to help her. No one defended her. The room simply watched as she was led away. Outside, the flashing lights of police vehicles painted the gym walls red and blue. The door closed behind them. And for the first time in months, the tension hanging over Stonebridge Ridge began to lift. I stood there for a moment, looking around the quiet gym, realizing something that hadn't fully sunk in until that second. The nightmare that had been tearing our community apart was finally over. The arrest at the school gym ended months of fear in less than 5 minutes. But the real aftermath took time. Within 48 hours of Karen Holloway, or Elizabeth Crawford, being taken into federal custody, investigators began uncovering just how deep her scheme actually went. The fake HOA documents she had been distributing around Stonebridge Ridge were only one piece of a much larger operation. Financial records showed that Crawford had been running similar scams in several states over nearly a decade. Each time the pattern was almost identical. She would enter a quiet community, create the illusion of an HOA authority, and begin targeting homeowners she believed were vulnerable. People living alone. Families already struggling. Veterans. Widows. Anyone she thought wouldn't have the time, money, or strength to fight back. The intimidation always started with paperwork, then threats. And when those didn't work, things often escalated into something far darker. By the time federal prosecutors finished building the case against her, the list of charges filled multiple pages. Arson, insurance fraud, forgery of judicial documents, wire fraud, attempted murder, and a long list of related conspiracy charges tied to property destruction in several states. Elizabeth Crawford never saw Stonebridge Ridge again. Months later, the trial ended with a verdict that surprised absolutely no one in the courtroom. multiple life sentences. The fake HOA she had tried to build collapsed instantly once the truth came out. Every document she had distributed was declared fraudulent. Every lien and violation notice she had issued was thrown out. But what mattered most wasn't what disappeared. It was what grew stronger afterward. For a while, the valley had felt divided. Karen had spent months trying to turn neighbors against each other, spreading rumors and convincing people they were alone. Once she was gone, that illusion broke quickly. The rebuilding started almost immediately. The first project was Elena Torres's house. The fire had destroyed everything she owned, but within days, neighbors began showing up with tools, lumber, and supplies. Victor Hale organized the work crews, coordinating volunteers like he was running a military operation again. Within 2 months, Elena and her kids moved into a brand new home built on the same foundation where the old one had burned. The next project was my cabin. I never asked for help rebuilding it. Truthfully, I'd planned to handle the work myself the way I had the first time, but one morning a pickup truck pulled into the driveway. Then another. By the end of the afternoon, half the valley was standing in my yard with tool belts and coffee cups. Victor simply looked at me and shrugged. "Community project," he said. It took 3 months. The new cabin stood stronger than the first one ever had. The beams were thicker, the roofline was reinforced, and the workshop behind the house was twice the size of the one Karen had destroyed. Victor eventually took on a new unofficial role in the valley as well. After everything that had happened, several neighbors asked him to coordinate a community safety group. Nothing formal, just a network of residents looking out for each other, sharing information, and making sure no outsider ever managed to divide the valley like that again. Life slowly returned to the quiet rhythm it had before Karen arrived. Morning coffee on the porch, the sound of wind moving through the trees, neighbors waving from the road instead of whispering about lawsuits and threats. One morning, several months after the trial ended, I stepped outside just as the sun was rising over the mountains. The valley below was calm again. Smoke from a few chimneys drifted into the cold air, and somewhere down the ridge I could hear Victor's truck starting up as he headed into town. For the first time in a long time, the place truly felt like home again. What happened in Stonebridge Ridge left everyone with a lesson that none of us were likely to forget. Bullies thrive when people feel isolated, when neighbors start believing they have to face problems alone. But the moment a community stands together, that kind of power disappears almost overnight. Karen Holloway believed she could control the valley by dividing it. Instead, she ended up reminding everyone exactly why we had moved there in the first place: to live freely and to look out for each other. I sat on the rebuilt porch that morning watching the sunlight spread across the trees, listening to the quiet return to the mountains. For the first time in months, the valley was peaceful again. If you want to hear more true stories like this, make sure you hit that subscribe button to HOA Update. And tell me in the comments, where are you watching from?